Grace and peace to you. We've come a long way since last week, haven't we? Last week when we were talking about sowing seeds, when we heard this parable and story of a sower who sowed indiscriminately scattered seeds in all kinds of places. We've now got full-size plants. And we're hearing a story of what it means that weeds are growing amongst those plants. From planting to weeding, just a week. But we know that that process takes longer. That process, as those who know how to garden and plant and grow things, is a long process of nurture and growth. That's why this story is so weird to me. Not just because we talked about a similar story last week, but because this story talks about weeds. And as people who grow things know, weeds are things that you take out of your garden. You remove them. That's not what happens in this story today. Jesus tells a parable, and it's about a man who owns this field, right? He plants good seed in this garden. And so the plants grow, but his employees come to him, right? His servants, they come and they tell him, hey, we've got a problem, master. There's weeds in the garden. Do you want us to uproot them, to pull them out? And the master says, no, don't. Leave them to grow alongside our good plants, because I would hate to hurt these good plants by pulling out the weeds. Doesn't seem to make much sense to us. And it didn't make much sense to the disciples either, right? Because at that point, if you look in your bulletin, if you're reading this story, the verse numbers skip. See, Jesus tells that story and then moves on. He tells two more parables, one of which is this familiar, beloved story of the mustard seed. Then there's one about yeast. But then we have the rest of our reading from today, where the disciples come to Jesus and ask him, hey, what's with that story about the wheat and the weeds? We don't get it. And so Jesus gives them an explanation that I don't like very much. See, Jesus tells them, see, the good plants, right? This good seed is like the good ones in the kingdom of God. And the evil one has planted weeds that also exist, and basically we're to wait till the harvest, right? I guess when the Son of Man returns, and then his angels will separate the good from the bad, and they'll throw the bad into unquenchable fire. See, I don't like it. And I've had a long time this week to think about why I don't. See, it's a story about judgment, and we don't like stories about judgment. See, I've struggled because I can't figure out why I don't like it. And I think there's two options. They all kind of stem from this idea that I don't like a God. I don't want to believe and worship and follow a God that would cast others into judgment. But what if I'm also scared of a God that would cast me into judgment? See, the verse that unlocked this text for me this week, I think it's verse 41. And in it, Jesus says, the Son of Man will send his angels, and they'll uproot all the causes. They'll destroy all the causes of sinfulness and evil. And if we're liking this story to people, right? We've got good people and bad people, and the angels of the Son of Man are going to destroy the bad ones. See, the problem there is I say I don't want to be a part of something, right? I want to follow a God that would destroy the others out there, right? Assuming that I'm in the good side. But then also, part of me says, what if I don't like this text because I'm scared that I might be in the other side? See, these lessons of judgment, these stories about that time cause us to put ourselves on one side or the other. And I think most of us, probably most of us even watching this video, right, from the person like me who's wearing this weird shirt with a white collar, to all of you listening at home who many would have been sitting in these wooden pews in front of me, we easily put ourselves in the good side. And why wouldn't we, right? We claim that in baptism, God has claimed us and made us to be His, to be God's special part of this garden that God is growing. So maybe I'm just reading the parable wrong. Maybe the weeds and the plants aren't supposed to be people. Maybe there's a different understanding. See, it made me think, right? I was thinking, what if plants and weeds can be part of the same person? See, we as Lutherans, we have this understanding that we are simultaneously saint and we are simultaneously sinner at the same time. Both exist within us. And so maybe a Lutheran understanding of this text involves me acknowledging that I have weeds and good seed in me at the same time. And then maybe that makes this reading easier to understand and even easier to swallow. But then I feel guilty again. What if I've taken the scandal out of this text? What if I've made it easier to understand? Because then I can say, oh, God's just going to get rid of the bad in me. Right? That's good news. That's great news. But that's not how plants work. When plants grow together, right, their roots dig deep and they spread out. They entangle themselves within each other. They grab a hold of one another. And so to pull out a plant can damage the plant next to it, can cause it harm and stress. So maybe there's not an easy way to hear this story. Maybe it's an understanding that at some time God is going to remove these weeds in my heart. And it's going to be painful. Judgment is painful. That process of destroying and throwing those things into the fire is going to hurt. And it's not an easy thing that I can just wait and say I'm happy to hear about, because I like the way my garden already is sometimes, and sin causes me to be happy with the way things are and to forget that things aren't supposed to be that way. See, I think when we talk about weeds, we have to understand what it is we're talking about. And I remember when I was in college, I worked at Agape, right? Camp Agape outside of Raleigh. And that ministry, Agape Curie Beach Ministries, has a very strong environmental focus. So we learn a lot about nature and God's creation. And that's where I learned what a weed was. So if you'd asked me before that what a weed was, I would have said, oh, it's like a dandelion, or those little sprouts that happen in the yard that don't look like my grass. I called certain things weeds and certain things weren't. But at camp, I learned that a weed, by definition, is just something that doesn't belong. That the prettiest of flowers can be a weed if that's not what you're trying to grow. And so then when we think about what the weeds are in this garden that God is growing, I don't think it's hard to figure out what they are. See, we talk a lot about what God's kingdom is, right? About love and justice and peace and goodwill and selflessness and putting people, other people, above ourselves by reaching out and including the outcast and the lowly, by making sure that those who have little have enough. Those are good plants, good things that God is growing in this world. So what are the bad things? What are the weeds? It's the things that don't belong. And they might look beautiful in some places. In the gardens of supremacy and racism and discrimination, these things seem to fit, but they don't fit here in God's garden. These plants that are growing, these plants of discrimination and hatred and division and racism and sexism, a toxic patriotism that has us following others more than we follow God, right? All these things are toxic to this garden. They are weeds that are growing in our hearts and in our lives and in this world. And that, I think, is what God or Jesus here in this parable is talking about. That those things that grow have to be removed. And this parable becomes even more tricky because I don't like it as well, because even as I come to this understanding that there are these weeds that have to be removed, and that many of them have grown so deep into my own life and my own heart, my own thoughts and actions, that it's going to be hard to root them out. That's hard. But maybe even harder is this understanding that it's not going to happen yet. Right? So this parable talks about waiting until the end, right? Waiting until the time that Jesus returns, right? The Son of Man comes back. And I don't like that either. If I know that there are these things in my life that don't belong, these things in God's garden and God's world that don't belong, why shouldn't we destroy them ourselves? Isn't our calling as Christians, right, as we say in our baptismal liturgy, right, to denounce, to defy, right, to stand against the forces of evil, the evil one, and all his stuff. That's what we're called to be about. But here, Jesus seems to be telling us to be patient and to wait. So what are we to do in that time period? What are we to do while we wait? I think the answer, right, to use words of gardening, our answer is to grow. It's to feed the good plants, to nurture them, to help them grow tall and strong, to help them establish firm roots so that when the other things are pulled out, those good things still remain. We think of nurturing our faith and how that doesn't stop, no matter how old we get or how good we think we understand what it means to follow Jesus. There's more to know. We are constantly growing into stronger and stronger followers of Jesus. And so perhaps our job is to grow big, to grow strong, to know that we can outgrow the weeds of division and hatred that grow among us. To rise above them so that we have clarity of vision and we can see the sun. We can see the sun that gives us strength and nourishment. Maybe that's our calling. As God's people of the ELCA, we use this phrase often, that the work that we do is God's work in our hands. God is tending and growing this garden of creation. Maybe God needs our hands to do that work, to help ourselves grow, to nourish ourselves, to grow big and tall, but also to help others grow, and to make sure that we're nourishing and watering and sustaining the goodness of God's kingdom. That's what we have to do. It's not going to be easy, but we have to do it as God's people. Because I don't think being patient means being complacent. There's still work to be done. Thanks be to God. Amen.